Have you ever looked back at a conversation and realized the real damage was not what the other person said, but how much of yourself you gave away trying to fix it? You explain your intentions. You clarify what you meant. You defend your tone, your decision, your distance, your pain. At first it feels reasonable, it even feels mature. But after a while, something begins to wear down inside you. Not because you are speaking, but because so much of your peace is being spent on people and situations that were never truly asking to understand you. That is where silence begins to change its meaning. Most people think silence is weakness, avoidance, or emotional withdrawal. But sometimes, silence is the first moment you stop abandoning yourself inside unnecessary conversations. It is the moment you no longer rush to manage every misunderstanding, calm every tension, or make yourself endlessly accessible to other people's moods. And once that shift begins, you start to notice something important. Some conflicts only survive because you keep feeding them. Some people only seem powerful because they have easy access to your reactions. Some connections feel deeper than they are, simply because you keep carrying them with your effort. This episode is about that kind of silence. Not cold silence, not performative silence, but the kind that protects your dignity, reveals people more clearly, and helps you return to yourself with more steadiness than before. So before anything else, we need to begin there. With the quiet way, silence stops you from giving too much of yourself away. 1. Silence removes your emotional leakage. There are moments in life that seem small from the outside, but they leave you strangely exhausted. A message that changes your mood for an hour. A conversation you replay long after it ends. A comment that stays in your mind longer than it should. You tell yourself it was nothing, just a few words, just a reaction, just one moment. But if you look carefully, it was never just the moment itself that drained you. It was how much of yourself you poured into it. That is what emotional leakage looks like. Not some dramatic collapse, not a visible breakdown, just a slow, repeated loss of energy through unnecessary reactions, through explaining too much, defending too much, trying too hard to correct how someone sees you, trying to make sure you are understood by people who were never really trying to understand you in the first place. And this is where silence starts to become something deeper than simply not speaking, because every time you react immediately, you give the situation direct access to your nervous system. You let it enter your mind, shape your mood, redirect your attention, and pull you away from yourself. What was supposed to be a passing moment becomes a psychological occupation. It stays with you while you work, while you sit alone, while you try to rest. And the painful part is that the other person often has no idea how much space they now occupy inside you. You feel this especially in relationships where you have already been overextending yourself. You try to keep the peace. You try to explain your intentions. You try to say things the right way so there is no misunderstanding. You try to be fair, mature, patient, and yet somehow, after all that effort, you still walk away feeling heavier than before. Not because you said the wrong thing, but because you kept sending your energy outward in the hope that clarity would protect you. But clarity does not always protect you. Sometimes it only exposes you more, because the more urgently you react, the more you reveal. You reveal what touches a nerve. You reveal what still controls you. You reveal how badly you want the situation to settle, how deeply you want the other person to finally understand, how strongly you need the tension to end. And once that pattern becomes visible, it becomes easy for someone else to press on it without even trying very hard. Not always out of cruelty. Sometimes simply because reactive energy invites more reaction. It keeps the door open. It tells the world, without words, that your peace is still negotiable. That is why silence matters. Silence closes the leak. It does not mean you feel nothing. It does not mean you become cold. It simply means the emotion no longer gets immediate access to your actions. The feeling rises, but it does not instantly become a message, an explanation, a defense, a paragraph, a late-night response, or another attempt to repair something that should not require so much repair. It stays with you for a moment. You hold it, you observe it, and in doing that, something very important happens. The energy that would have left you stays with you. And when it stays with you, it begins to strengthen you. Because now you are no longer living at the mercy of every small disturbance. Now there is a pause between what happens and what you do about it. And inside that pause, your power returns. Not loudly, not theatrically, quietly, the way real power usually does. Think about how much of your day can be shaped by one unnecessary reaction, one text sent too quickly, one explanation that was never needed, one emotional reply that keeps a dead conversation alive for 3 more hours in your mind. This is how people lose themselves in fragments, not through one major event, but through 100 small leaks. A little energy here, a little peace there, a little dignity somewhere else. Until one day they feel tired all the time and cannot fully explain why. Sometimes the answer is simple. You have been available to everything, every tone, every shift, every hint of tension, every misunderstanding, every invitation to react. And that kind of availability comes at a price. So maybe the next time something pulls at you, you do not rush to answer it. Maybe you let the first wave pass. Maybe you let the heat inside the moment settle before deciding whether it deserves your voice at all. Sometimes it will, but many times what you really needed was not a better response. It was a little distance, a little stillness, a little refusal to let the moment take more from you than it deserves. That is how silence begins to heal you. Not because silence solves everything, but because it stops everything from entering you so easily. And after a while, you begin to notice a change. You feel less scattered, less invaded, less emotionally available to things that once ruined your whole day. Your mind becomes quieter because you are no longer feeding every disturbance with language. Your presence becomes steadier because you are no longer pouring yourself into every passing tension. You stop living as an open wound, reacting to every touch, and you start living like someone who knows that peace is not something to beg the world for, it is something to protect. Because in the end, the real danger was never that people misunderstood you. It was that in trying so hard to be understood, you kept giving away pieces of yourself. And silence, used well, is how you begin taking them back. 2. You see people clearly when you stop responding. One of the strangest things about human relationships is how much becomes invisible when you are too busy participating in them. When you are always replying, always clarifying, always trying to keep the emotional rhythm going, you often feel deeply involved, but not necessarily clear. You know the tone, the tension, the confusion, the pull. You feel everything, but feeling everything is not the same as seeing clearly. In fact, sometimes it is the very thing that prevents clarity. Because when you are constantly responding, part of your attention is always occupied with managing the moment. You are thinking about what to say, how it will land, whether it will calm things down, whether it will make you seem fair, mature, kind, reasonable. And while your attention is tied up in that effort, the deeper truth of the interaction keeps moving beneath the surface without being fully noticed. You are inside the current, trying to swim well, when what you really need is enough stillness to step back and see where the water is actually taking you. That is why silence changes so much. The moment you stop reacting in real time, the whole interaction begins to reveal itself differently. The pace changes. The emotional fog begins to thin, and people, when they are no longer being guided by your energy, start showing more of their natural shape. Not always dramatically, often in quiet ways, in how they handle distance, in whether they move toward clarity or away from it, in whether they become more respectful, more honest, more patient, or more irritated, more manipulative, more vague. You start noticing things that were always there, but were hard to see while you were still emotionally busy. You notice who only seemed engaged because you were carrying the conversation. You notice who becomes uneasy when they can no longer read your reactions. You notice who steps forward with sincerity when there is no emotional performance left to hide behind, and who quietly fades when your attention is no longer available on demand. The silence does not create these truths. It only removes the noise that kept them hidden. And that can be uncomfortable, because a lot of confusion survives through movement. As long as something is still being said, still being explained, still being emotionally managed, you can keep telling yourself that the situation is still unfolding, that the person is still uncertain, that maybe if you wait, explain, or respond just a little better, the truth will become easier to live with. But when you become quiet, all that movement slows down, and when it slows down, reality becomes harder to avoid. You begin to see who is actually consistent, not just in the words they choose when the moment is warm, but in the effort they make when the rhythm changes, not in the promises they offered while your energy was still keeping everything alive, but in the way they behave when there is space, distance, and less emotional reward available to them. This is where silence becomes almost like light entering a dark room. Nothing new is being created. You are simply able to see what was already there. And often, what you see is simpler than what your anxious mind had made it. The mixed signal becomes indifference. The emotional pull becomes inconsistency. The intensity becomes dependency on your reactions. The bond that felt deep begins to look more one-sided than you wanted to admit. That clarity can sting, but it also frees you. Because once you see clearly, you stop wasting so much energy trying to interpret what repeated behavior has already explained. You stop chasing meaning through endless analysis. You stop searching for hidden depth in patterns that are actually very plain once the noise dies down. And perhaps most importantly, you stop confusing your own emotional investment with the actual value of the connection. That distinction matters more than most people realize. A connection can feel intense and still be unhealthy. It can occupy your thoughts and still lack substance. It can produce strong emotion and still not deserve your trust. Silence helps you separate what is merely stimulating from what is actually stable. It helps you stop asking only, "How do I feel around this person?" and begin asking the more honest question, "What do they consistently show when I stop doing so much of the work?" That question changes everything, because there comes a point where maturity is no longer measured by how well you explain, how much patience you show, or how long you keep trying to understand. Sometimes maturity looks like becoming still enough to let the pattern finish speaking for itself. Sometimes it means no longer interrupting reality with your hope. Sometimes it means letting the silence stay long enough for the truth to become undeniable. And usually, the truth does become undeniable, not because people confess it, not because they suddenly become transparent, but because once you stop responding so quickly, they no longer have your energy to hide behind. So maybe the next time you feel confused by someone, instead of moving immediately toward another message, another explanation, another attempt to read the moment from inside the emotion of it, you give the situation a little room, not to punish, not to manipulate, just to see, just to let the pattern breathe without your constant intervention. Because when you stop responding all the time, something very quiet but very important begins to happen. You stop reading only what people say, and you begin seeing what they are. 3. Silence forces others to reveal their true intentions. There's a moment in almost every interaction that most people move past too quickly to notice. It comes right after something is said. A slight pause, a space where the conversation could either deepen, shift, or simply end. And almost instinctively you step in. You respond, you clarify, you keep things moving. It feels natural. But in doing that, you often take away the one thing that would have shown you what the other person was really about, because silence creates a kind of pressure that words cannot. Not loud pressure, not confrontation, just a quiet absence that makes the other person sit with the moment a little longer than they expected. And most people are not comfortable in that space. They start filling it. They add more than they planned. They explain what they didn't intend to explain. They reveal tone, intention, and sometimes even contradiction without realizing it. But when you rush to respond, you remove that pressure. You make it easy for them to stay composed, to stay controlled, to stay within the version of themselves they want you to see. You meet them halfway before they have to show you how far they were actually willing to go on their own. And that is how intentions stay hidden. Not because people are always calculating or deceptive, but because the interaction never required them to go beyond the surface. You kept the flow going. You kept the rhythm alive. You filled the gaps before they had to. Silence changes that. When you stop guiding the moment, the responsibility shifts. Now the other person has to decide what they actually want to do with the space. Do they move toward clarity, or do they retreat into vagueness? Do they stay consistent, or do they become uneven? Do they reach out with sincerity, or do they wait to see if you will come back and carry the interaction again? These are not questions you need to ask. They answer themselves in behavior. And behavior, especially when there is no pressure from you to shape it, tends to be honest in a way words rarely are. Not perfectly honest, but revealing enough. Over time, patterns begin to form. Effort either shows up or it doesn't. Presence either stabilizes or disappears. The energy either becomes clearer or more confusing, and that is where something important settles inside you. You stop trying to extract truth through conversation alone. You stop believing that one more explanation, one more question, one more attempt at clarity will finally give you the answer you're looking for. Because you begin to see that the answer has been there, not in what they say, but in what they consistently do when you are no longer shaping the moment for them. This is often where disappointment and clarity arrive together, because sometimes what silence reveals is not what you hoped for. Sometimes it shows distance where you thought there was depth, inconsistency where you thought there was complexity, indifference where you thought there was confusion. And facing that quietly, without immediately trying to repair it, takes a different kind of strength. But it is a cleaner kind of strength. It does not come from winning an argument or getting the perfect explanation. It comes from no longer needing either of those things to understand what is already being shown to you. That is why silence is not passive. It is observational. It allows reality to unfold without your constant interference. It removes the emotional scaffolding that was holding the interaction together. And when that scaffolding is gone, whatever remains is much closer to the truth than anything that could have been argued into existence. So maybe the next time you feel that instinct to step in quickly, to respond, to clarify, to keep things from becoming uncertain, you let the moment stay incomplete for a little longer. Not to create distance, but to allow honesty to surface without being directed. Because people reveal themselves all the time, just not when you are speaking over the moment that would have shown you who they are. 4. Not explaining protects your dignity. There is a point in some conversations where your words stop serving you and start costing you. It rarely feels obvious at first. In the beginning, explaining yourself can feel like maturity. It feels reasonable to clarify what you meant, to make your intentions known, to give context so the other person does not misunderstand you. And sometimes that is healthy. Sometimes clarity matters. But there is another kind of explaining that has nothing to do with clarity. It comes from discomfort, from pressure, from the fear of being seen the wrong way, from the deeper fear that if you do not make yourself understandable enough, acceptable enough, soft enough, fair enough, then you will be judged, rejected, or turned into the villain in someone else's story. And once you are speaking from that place, something inside the conversation begins to change. You are no longer expressing yourself. You are defending your right to be yourself. That is where dignity begins to slip, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would always notice. But you feel it. You feel it in the heaviness that settles in after the conversation ends, in the strange fatigue that comes from giving too many words to something that should have required very few, in the quiet shame of realizing you kept adding sentence after sentence, not because the truth needed more language, but because you were hoping more language would finally make the other person respond with fairness, and that hope can be expensive. Because the more you explain from a place of emotional pressure, the more your boundary begins to sound negotiable, the more you justify your distance, your no, your choice, your silence, the more it can start to feel like a request rather than a decision. And some people know how to use that. They may not do it in dramatic ways. Sometimes they simply keep asking, keep pushing, keep acting confused, keep inviting you into one more round of explanation until you begin to sound uncertain about something you were originally very clear about. That is one of the quietest forms of self-betrayal, not when you lie, but when you keep talking past the point where your dignity was already asking for silence. Because dignity has a certain stillness to it. It does not always need to prove. It does not always need to defend. It does not always need to convert itself into something easier for other people to accept. Sometimes dignity is simply the decision to let your choice stand without dressing it up for someone who is committed to resisting it anyway. That is a hard lesson for many people, especially the ones who have spent years trying to be fair, kind, emotionally intelligent, and deeply understood. Those people often believe that if they just explain well enough, calmly enough, thoroughly enough, the truth will finally land. But not everyone is confused because you were unclear. Some people are confused because confusion gives them room. It keeps the conversation open. It keeps your energy available. It keeps your boundary from becoming final. And that is why silence can be protective. Because silence refuses to turn your truth into a debate. It stops the endless process of translating your inner world for people who have not earned that level of access. It stops the habit of overexposing yourself in the hope that being fully understood will finally bring peace. It reminds you that not every person deserves the full map of how you arrived at your decision. Some people only need the decision itself. That does not make you cold, it makes you whole. You begin to realize that self-respect is not always loud. It is not always a dramatic speech, a final confrontation, or a powerful declaration. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to keep handing your clarity to someone who wants to pull it apart until you no longer trust your own center. Sometimes it is the calm decision to leave your boundary where it is and not drag it through another exhausting conversation just so someone else can feel more comfortable with it. And that changes the emotional posture of your life. You stop over-explaining your distance. You stop over-justifying your no. You stop over-defending your peace. Not because you have become detached from people, but because you have become more loyal to what your inner life actually needs. So maybe the next time you feel that familiar urge to explain one more time, to add one more detail, to make your choice more acceptable, you pause and ask yourself a quieter question. Am I speaking because the truth needs to be expressed, or because I'm afraid to let it stand on its own? That question can save you from saying far more than the moment deserves. Because in the end, dignity is not protected by better wording. It is protected by knowing when your truth no longer needs another sentence. 5. Silence breaks manipulation cycles. Some patterns in life do not feel dangerous at first because they do not arrive as obvious control. They arrive as tension, as inconsistency, as a small emotional disturbance that pulls your attention and makes you feel that something now needs to be fixed. A strange tone, a delayed reply, a vague message, a sudden coldness after warmth. On the surface, each moment seems small, but if it happens often enough, a rhythm begins to form. And before you fully understand what is happening, you are living inside that rhythm. You start anticipating shifts. You start reading between lines that should never have needed that much reading. You start trying to stabilize what the other person keeps unsettling. And in that effort, something subtle begins to happen. Your energy stops belonging to you. It becomes tied to the emotional weather of the connection. That is how many manipulation cycles survive. Not through obvious force, but through repetition. Through keeping you slightly off balance. Through creating just enough uncertainty to keep you engaged. Just enough distance to make you reach. Just enough tension to make you want to resolve it. And once that happens, the cycle no longer needs a dramatic event to continue. It runs on your reaction, on your need to close the gap, on your habit of turning discomfort into effort. This is what makes it so confusing, because from the inside, it often feels like care. It feels like patience, maturity, emotional openness. You tell yourself you are trying to understand, trying to communicate well, trying not to let things fall apart. But if the same confusion keeps returning, if the same imbalance keeps asking you to do the emotional labor of repair, then at some point the more honest question is no longer whether you care. It is whether the pattern is feeding on your care. Some people, consciously or not, learn how to keep access to you through instability. They may not even think of themselves as manipulative. They may simply be used to dynamics where confusion keeps people close, where emotional unpredictability creates intensity, where your effort becomes the bridge that carries the relationship while they contribute very little to the actual repair. And because you are the one who wants peace, you become the one who keeps returning with words, reassurance, questions, and explanations. The cycle continues because your nervous system keeps volunteering to complete it. That is why silence matters so much here. Because silence interrupts the pattern at the point where it usually gets its reward. It stops the automatic movement toward repair. It stops the immediate response. It stops the familiar exchange in which tension appears, and your energy rushes in to manage it. And once that happens, something the pattern relies on is suddenly missing: your participation. Without that participation, the rhythm begins to weaken. The same behavior that once pulled you in now meets space. The same emotional hook that used to catch you now meets delay, stillness, or no reaction at all. And when that happens, the truth of the dynamic often becomes much clearer. Some people become more direct when they can no longer rely on confusion. Some become more respectful. Some simply fade because the pattern no longer works. And some become more agitated because the silence has removed the easy access they had to your attention. That response tells you more than another conversation ever could. Because healthy connection does not collapse when immediate emotional access is no longer available. It adapts, it steadies, it becomes clearer. A manipulative rhythm, on the other hand, often reveals itself the moment your usual response is missing. What looked like connection begins to show itself as dependency on reaction. What felt complicated begins to look patterned. And that recognition can be deeply relieving. Not because it is pleasant, often it is not. Sometimes it hurts to see how much of the cycle survived through your own hope, your own patience, your own willingness to keep making meaning out of behavior that was already telling the truth. But there is relief in finally seeing it. Relief in no longer having to participate in something just because it has become familiar. Relief in realizing that peace does not require you to keep completing the same emotional ritual over and over again. So maybe the next time a familiar disturbance appears, something that would once have pulled you immediately into analysis, explanation, or repair, you let the moment stay incomplete for a while. You do not rush to decode it. You do not rush to soothe it. You do not rush to save the connection from the discomfort it has created. You let the pattern stand long enough to see whether it knows how to exist without your constant help. Because that is often where the answer is. Not in what they say after the tension, not in the apology that comes once you are already drained, not in the promise that things will be different next time, but in whether the pattern still survives when your energy stops feeding it. And for many people, that is where silence becomes more than restraint. It becomes the first real break in a cycle that would have kept repeating for as long as you kept answering it. 6. You regain control over conversations. There is a point in many conversations where something shifts, not in what is being said, but in how it is unfolding. The pace quickens, the tone tightens. You feel a pull to respond a little faster than usual, to clarify before things get misunderstood, to stay present so the moment doesn't drift into something uncomfortable. And without noticing exactly when it happened, you are no longer choosing your words. You are following the momentum. That momentum can feel subtle, but it changes everything. The conversation starts guiding you instead of the other way around. You speak to keep up, not to express. You respond to maintain balance, not because your words are necessary. And as the exchange continues, you begin to give more than you intended, not in content alone, but in attention, in emotional involvement, in the quiet pressure to keep things from slipping into tension. This is how control is often lost. Not through force, not through someone dominating you, but through speed and emotional pull. Because when things move quickly, you have less space to think. When emotions rise, you feel the need to answer them. And when both happen together, you are no longer deciding your response. You are reacting to the moment as it unfolds, trying to stay aligned with something that is already moving faster than your awareness. Silence changes that rhythm. When you stop responding immediately, the pace breaks. The automatic exchange of reaction and counter-reaction slows down. And in that slowing, something returns that is easy to overlook when everything is moving: choice. You begin to feel the difference between speaking because something needs to be said and speaking because the moment is pulling it out of you. You begin to notice that not every sentence deserves a reply. Not every tone requires correction. Not every misunderstanding needs to be resolved in real time. And as that awareness grows, your words begin to change. They become fewer. Not forced, not calculated, just more deliberate. You say what matters and you leave what does not. You stop trying to cover every angle, explain every detail, or anticipate every possible reaction. And because of that, your presence inside the conversation shifts. You are no longer someone trying to manage the flow. You are someone who can hold it. That difference is felt, even if it is not named. The other person notices it in the space between your responses, in the way you do not rush, in the way you are not pulled into every shift of tone, in the way you seem less available to the emotional currents that usually shape the exchange. and often that changes how they respond. The conversation becomes steadier or clearer, or in some cases it reveals itself as something that only functioned when you were feeding it with constant attention. And that realization matters, because not every conversation deserves your full engagement. Not every exchange is meant to be completed. Some interactions lose their force the moment you stop giving them immediate energy. Some tensions dissolve when they are not answered right away. And some patterns become visible only when you step out of them long enough to see where they were taking you. So maybe the next time you feel that familiar pull to respond quickly, to stay on top of the moment, to keep everything smooth and clear, you allow a small delay. Not to create distance, but to restore perspective, to feel whether your response is actually needed or simply expected. Because when you give yourself that space, something begins to settle. You are no longer inside the conversation trying to keep up with it. You are just outside it, aware enough to shape it. And in that position, control does not need to be asserted. It returns on its own, quietly, the moment you stop giving it away. 7. Silence exposes who only valued your reactions. There are connections that feel alive, not because they are grounded, but because they are constantly moving. There is always something being said, something being felt, something being adjusted. The interaction never really settles. It stays active, and that activity can feel like closeness, like involvement, like something meaningful is happening simply because there is always a response waiting on the other side. But activity is not the same as value, and the difference between the two becomes much clearer the moment you stop reacting the way you used to. At first, nothing dramatic happens. You just become a little quieter. You take a bit more time before responding. You stop filling every gap. You stop carrying the rhythm of the interaction on your own. And in that small shift, something begins to change. The connection is no longer being sustained by your reactions. It has to stand on its own. That is where things start to reveal themselves. You begin to notice who stays present even when the pace slows down, and who fades when there is no longer constant movement. Who reaches out with intention and who only seemed engaged when you were the one keeping things going. Who adjusts naturally to your stillness and who becomes unsettled when they can no longer predict your responses. These changes are not always loud, but they are consistent. Because when your reactions are no longer available on demand, the dynamic loses its familiar support. The person on the other side can no longer rely on your energy to keep the connection feeling active. And without that support, what remains is their natural level of effort, their natural level of presence, their natural level of interest. And that level is often more honest than anything they ever said. This is where a quiet realization begins to take shape. Some people were not connected to you in the way you thought. They were connected to your availability, to your attention, to your responsiveness, to the way you made the interaction feel alive. And when that changes, when you are no longer providing that same level of engagement, they do not always know how to stay. Not because you became distant, but because the version of the connection they were used to depended on something you were giving more than they were. That realization can feel unsettling, not because it is confusing, but because it is clear. You start to see that what felt mutual may not have been balanced, that what felt deep may have been driven by your own investment, that what felt consistent may have been sustained by your effort more than theirs. And once you see that, it becomes difficult to return to the old pattern without also feeling the weight of what you now understand. Silence does not create this truth, it simply removes what was covering it. Because when you are always reacting, always engaging, always keeping the connection active, it becomes easy to assume that the energy is shared. But when you step back, even slightly, and allow the interaction to exist without your constant input, the structure becomes visible. You see who contributes to it and who depends on you to carry it. And that distinction matters more than it seems. It shifts how you interpret people. It shifts how much you give. It shifts what you are willing to maintain. Not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through observation. So maybe the next time you feel a connection changing as you become quieter, you resist the urge to restore it immediately. You do not rush back into the old rhythm. You do not try to bring back the same level of activity just to keep things feeling familiar. Instead, you let the silence stay long enough to show you what remains when your reactions are no longer sustaining it, because that is often where the truth becomes undeniable. The people who genuinely value you will not depend on your constant reactions to stay present. And the ones who disappear when your energy is no longer available on demand were never really connected to you in the way you believed. 8. It removes unnecessary conflict from your life. A surprising amount of conflict in life begins long before anything truly serious has happened. It starts in small moments that arrive with a little tension attached to them. A sentence that feels slightly sharp, a delay that seems heavier than it should, a tone that leaves behind a feeling you cannot fully explain. On the surface, none of it looks major, but the mind rarely waits for clarity. It moves quickly, trying to define the moment before the moment has had time to define itself. That is where a great deal of unnecessary conflict is born. Not in the original event itself, but in the speed with which it is answered. Something unsettles you, and almost immediately you feel the need to do something with it. You want to clarify. You want to correct. You want to keep it from becoming bigger. And because that instinct feels responsible, it is easy to mistake it for wisdom. But many times what feels like maturity is only discomfort rushing to protect itself from uncertainty. The problem is that once you react too quickly, the moment starts expanding. What might have passed in silence becomes a conversation. What might have remained vague now takes on structure, tone, and emotional weight. More words are added. More interpretation enters. The situation is no longer just what happened. It becomes everything that was poured into it afterward, and that is often the real source of exhaustion. You are not only carrying the original irritation, you are carrying the explanation, the response, the follow-up, the attempt to settle it, the mental replay that keeps returning later in the day. A small moment enters your life and somehow takes up far more space than it ever deserved. Not because it was powerful on its own, but because it was given too much energy before it had time to show what it really was. Silence interrupts that process. When you do not move toward the moment immediately, something important happens. The situation is left alone long enough to either keep its weight or lose it. And many things lose their weight surprisingly fast when they are not fed with instant emotion. What felt sharp becomes unclear. What felt urgent becomes temporary. What seemed personal begins to look more like mood, stress, habit, projection, or simple human imperfection. That does not mean every issue disappears. Some things remain. Some things do need to be addressed. But silence helps separate what is actually meaningful from what only felt intense in the first wave of reaction. Without that pause, everything arrives with the same emotional volume. With it, you begin to notice that life becomes much easier to carry when not every uncomfortable moment is turned into a problem that now requires your voice. This is especially important in relationships where tension has become a pattern. Some people are used to conversations that escalate quickly. A small misunderstanding becomes a larger emotional exchange because neither side leaves enough room for the moment to settle. In that kind of dynamic, silence can feel unnatural at first, almost as if you are neglecting something that needs attention. But often you are doing the opposite. You are refusing to enlarge something that would not survive without constant emotional participation. That refusal can change the whole atmosphere of your life. You begin to notice how many things no longer follow you for hours after they happen, how much less crowded your mind feels when every irritation does not become a conversation, how much more stable you feel when you stop handing your nervous system over to every tone, every shift, every passing friction. The external world may still be imperfect, but your inner world is no longer reacting as if every small disturbance deserves a permanent place inside it. And little by little, that changes your relationship with peace. Peace no longer feels like something fragile that must be defended in every moment. It becomes something steadier than that, something shaped not only by what happens around you, but by what you refuse to keep feeding once it has entered. You begin to understand that many forms of conflict live far longer than they should because someone keeps giving them language, attention, and emotional force. Once that stops, many of them lose the structure they needed to keep growing. So maybe the next time a small tension appears, you do not rush to name it, solve it, or respond to it before you have truly seen it. Maybe you let the first emotional wave pass and watch what remains after that. Maybe you allow the moment to show whether it is actually important or merely uncomfortable. That small delay often reveals more than another immediate reply ever could. Because many things that disturb you are not asking for a reaction. They are only passing through. And once you stop turning every passing disturbance into a conversation, your life becomes quieter in a way that feels less like avoidance and more like wisdom. You do not lose your voice. You simply stop spending it on things that were never worth the cost. 9. Silence strengthens your internal voice. One of the quietest things a person can lose is not confidence, not motivation, not even peace in the obvious sense. It is the ability to hear themselves clearly. That inner voice becomes faint so gradually that many people do not notice it disappearing. They only notice the symptoms. They second-guess themselves more. They need more reassurance than they used to. They replay conversations longer than they should. They become more sensitive to tone, more dependent on response, more easily thrown off by someone else's mood or distance or approval. And what is really happening underneath all of that is simple. Their inner world has become too crowded. Too many outside voices are living there. Too many reactions, too many interpretations, too many emotional leftovers from things that should have passed through without taking root. A message changes the direction of the day. A comment keeps echoing in the mind. A conversation follows them into the evening. They sit alone, but they are not really alone. The room is full of other people's tone, other people's opinions, other people's energy, other people's unfinished presence. When that happens often enough, your own voice starts getting interrupted before it can fully form. You feel something, but before you can understand it, you are already thinking about how it looked to someone else. You sense that something is wrong, but before you can sit with that knowing, you are already explaining it away, or trying to become more reasonable, more patient, more understanding of behavior that quietly hurt you. You want something, but before you can admit it honestly, you are already negotiating with imagined reactions. That is how a person becomes distant from themselves. Not through one dramatic betrayal, but through 1,000 small moments of abandoning their own perception in favor of managing the atmosphere around them. Silence begins repairing that distance, not all at once, and not in some theatrical way. It begins in smaller moments than that. In the moments where you do not answer immediately, in the moments where you allow something to stay unresolved for a little while, so you can hear what you actually think before the world starts telling you what to think. In the moments where you resist the urge to speak simply because discomfort has appeared. those moments create space. And space is what your internal voice has been waiting for, because your deeper knowing rarely shouts. It does not usually arrive with the same urgency as fear, ego, anxiety, or the need to fix a moment. It speaks more quietly than that. It needs stillness. It needs room. It needs enough silence for your own perception to rise before the pressure to react buries it again. That is why many people say they feel more like themselves after a period of distance, stillness, or withdrawal from constant communication. It is not because silence itself is magical. It is because silence reduces interference. It lowers the volume of everything external, long enough for your own inner truth to become audible again. And once that starts happening, you notice subtle but important changes. You begin to trust your reading of people a little more. You begin to recognize the difference between intuition and anxiety. You stop needing immediate reassurance every time uncertainty appears. You become less likely to betray what you feel just because someone else seems uncomfortable with it. Your boundaries begin to feel less like performances and more like natural extensions of what you know to be true for you. That shift matters, because a strong internal voice changes the way you move through life. It changes how you choose, how you leave, how you stay, how you respond, how much nonsense you tolerate, how quickly you notice when something is costing you too much. It does not make you cold. It makes you rooted. It gives you an inner reference point that does not collapse every time the outside world becomes emotionally noisy. And that kind of steadiness is rare. A lot of people are not actually confused about what they feel. They are simply surrounded by so much noise that they no longer trust what they already know. They have heard too many opinions, answered too many messages, explained themselves too many times, reopened too many conversations that should have ended in silence. The result is that their own voice begins to sound uncertain to them, not because it is weak, but because it is always being spoken over. So maybe the practice here is simpler than it seems. The next time something unsettles you, instead of moving immediately toward a response, stay with yourself a little longer than usual. Let the first wave pass. Let the need to explain calm down. Let other people's energy move away from the center of your mind. And then notice what is left when the noise drops. What remains there is often much closer to the truth than the first reaction ever was. Because silence does not only protect your peace, it also gives your own mind a chance to become a place you can hear again. And once your inner voice becomes clear enough, something else begins to fade with it. Your need to keep asking the world who you are. 10. It builds an aura of control and mystery. There is a kind of presence you can feel in someone before they say anything, not because they are trying to stand out, and not because they are doing something impressive, but because there is a steadiness about them that does not shift with every small change in the room. They are not rushing to respond. They are not adjusting themselves to match every tone. They are simply there, and that presence feels contained in a way that is difficult to explain. What you are sensing in that moment is not mystery as performance. It is self-possession, and one of the simplest ways that quality begins to appear is through silence. Not silence as withdrawal, and not silence as a strategy to seem interesting, but silence as a form of restraint. The ability to let a moment exist without immediately filling it. The ability to feel something without needing to express it right away. The ability to stay with yourself even when there is subtle pressure to reveal more than the moment actually requires. Most people lose that quality early in the interaction. They speak to remove discomfort. They explain to stay understood. They respond quickly so nothing feels uncertain. And in doing so, they make themselves easy to read in all the ways that reduce depth. Their reactions become predictable. Their emotional state becomes visible in real time. Their presence becomes something that can be measured and adjusted to without much effort. There is nothing wrong with openness. But there is a difference between openness and constant exposure. When everything about you is available immediately, there is no distance between your inner world and the outside environment. Every shift in the room has direct access to you. Every tone can influence you. Every moment can pull something out of you. And over time, that kind of openness does not create connection. It creates instability. Silence changes that dynamic in a subtle but important way. When you stop responding instantly, you begin to gather yourself. Your reactions are no longer happening in front of everyone as they form. Your thoughts are no longer being released in real time. There is a small but meaningful distance between what you feel and what you express, and in that distance, something begins to take shape. Your presence becomes less reactive. Not in a forced way, but in a natural one. You are no longer being moved by every small shift, so you start to feel more consistent, more grounded, less dependent on the flow of the interaction. And that consistency is what people often interpret as control, not control over others, control over yourself. That difference matters, because when someone is steady in that way, the room adjusts to them rather than the other way around. Conversations slow slightly. Responses become more considered. The interaction begins to feel less chaotic, not because anything was forced, but because one person is no longer amplifying every small fluctuation. At the same time, something else becomes noticeable. There is a sense that not everything about you is immediately available. Not because you are hiding, but because you are not offering everything at once. You are not explaining beyond what is necessary. You are not reacting in a way that makes your entire internal state visible. You allow some things to remain unspoken until they are worth saying. That creates a different kind of depth. People do not feel like they have instant access to all of you. They sense that there is more there than what is being shown in the moment, and that awareness changes how they relate to you. Not because you are trying to create mystery, but because you are no longer removing all distance through constant expression. And that distance has value. It allows your words to carry more weight when they do come. It prevents your presence from being flattened into immediate reactions. It gives you time to understand what you actually want to say before you say it. And it keeps your inner world from being shaped too quickly by whatever happens around you. So maybe the shift here is not about trying to appear more controlled or more mysterious. It is about becoming less available to impulse, letting your responses come from a place that has had time to settle. Allowing moments to exist without needing to complete them immediately with words. Because when that becomes natural, something changes in how you are experienced. You feel less scattered, more contained, less reactive to the room, more anchored within yourself. And in that state, your presence begins to carry something that does not need to be explained. Not because you said more, but because you stopped giving everything away the moment it appeared. 11. Silence makes your presence more valuable. There is a quiet shift that happens when you stop being constantly available, not just physically but emotionally. When you are no longer responding to everything, no longer filling every gap, no longer offering your attention on demand, something about your presence begins to change. At first, it may feel like you are doing less talking, less explaining, less engaging in moments that once pulled you in. But what is actually happening is not reduction, it is refinement. Because when your energy is no longer spread across every small interaction, it begins to gather. And when it gathers, it becomes noticeable in a different way. Your presence starts to feel more intentional. Not because you are trying to make an impression, but because you are no longer giving pieces of yourself away without choosing to. Most people are easy to access. Not in a negative sense, but in a habitual one. They respond quickly. They engage often. They make their attention readily available. And while that can feel warm and open, it also creates a certain predictability. Their presence becomes something that is always there in the same way, regardless of the situation. Over time, that consistency of access can quietly reduce the weight of it. Not because they lack value, but because their presence is no longer something that needs to be recognized. It is simply expected. Silence interrupts that expectation. When you are not always available in the same way, your presence becomes something that stands out when it appears. Not dramatically, not as a performance, but through contrast. You are no longer part of the constant background of interaction. You enter more selectively. You speak more deliberately. You engage when it matters, rather than whenever the moment invites you to. That shift changes how your presence is felt. It begins to carry more weight, not because you are trying to be important, but because you are no longer treating your own attention as something that must be offered everywhere. You start to recognize that your time, your focus, your emotional energy are limited, and that how you distribute them shapes how they are experienced by others. This is not about becoming distant or unavailable in a rigid way. It is about becoming intentional. There is a difference between withholding yourself out of fear and choosing where you place your energy out of awareness. One feels tense and closed. The other feels calm and grounded. And people can sense that difference, even if they cannot explain it. When your presence comes from that grounded place, it does not need to compete for attention. It does not need to prove itself through constant interaction. It simply carries a different quality, one that is less reactive, less scattered, and more aligned with your own sense of direction. You begin to notice that conversations feel different when you enter them this way. You are not trying to sustain them. You are not trying to keep them alive. You are not measuring your worth through how much you are involved. You are simply there when you choose to be, and absent when you do not. That simplicity has a kind of strength to it, because it removes the pressure to be everything, everywhere, all the time. It allows your presence to remain connected to your intention rather than to other people's expectations. And over time, that creates a form of quiet consistency. Not the consistency of always being available, but the consistency of being aligned with yourself. That is what gives your presence value. Not how often it appears, but how it feels when it does. So maybe the shift is not about becoming more interesting, more engaging, or more visible. It is about becoming more selective with where your energy goes, letting your presence follow your intention instead of your impulses, allowing yourself to step back from interactions that do not deserve you and to step into those that do with more clarity. Because when you stop offering yourself everywhere, you begin to notice something unexpected. Where you do show up starts to matter more. And that is not something you have to explain. It is something people feel, even in silence. What makes silence so difficult for many people is not that it is empty. It is that it leaves you alone with what your reactions used to cover. The need to be understood, the fear of being misread, the habit of explaining too much, giving too much, fixing too much, staying emotionally available long after the moment has already shown you what it is. That is why silence can feel uncomfortable at first. It removes the old movement. It takes away the familiar reflex of doing something immediately. It asks you to stay still long enough to see what remains when you stop managing everything with words. And what remains is often the truth. You see where your energy has been leaking. You see which connections depended too heavily on your effort. You see how quickly conflict fades when it is not fed. You see how much stronger your own inner voice becomes when outside noise no longer has constant access to your mind. You see that dignity is often protected not by saying more, but by knowing when enough has already been said. None of this means silence should become a performance. It is not about appearing cold, distant, or powerful for the sake of image. It is about no longer making your peace available to every passing disturbance. It is about becoming more deliberate with your attention, your presence, and your words. It is about learning that not everything deserves access to your nervous system, your explanations, or your emotional labor. That is where silence stops being absence and starts becoming strength, because real silence is not passive. It is chosen. It is the decision to stop pouring yourself into places that keep asking for more than they are worth. It is the decision to let people reveal themselves without your constant participation. It is the decision to protect something inside you that becomes harder to recover every time you spend it carelessly. And once that choice becomes natural, something changes in the way you move through life. You are not as easy to provoke. You do not feel as pulled by every shift in tone or mood. You become less available to manipulation, less exhausted by unnecessary conflict, less dependent on being understood by those who were never trying to understand you honestly in the first place. You begin to carry yourself differently, not louder, not harder, just with more steadiness. And that steadiness has a quiet kind of power to it, the kind that does not need to prove itself every few minutes, the kind that does not depend on winning the conversation, getting the last word, or making sure everyone sees your side, the kind that knows your piece is worth more than another explanation. So maybe that is where this really ends, not in silence as a tactic, but in silence as a form of self-respect. A way of no longer abandoning yourself in the name of keeping everything smooth, clear, and emotionally manageable for everyone else. Because after a certain point, saying less is not what makes you lose people. It is what helps you stop losing yourself.